Thank you, Jonathan. Matthew Collar here. Judd Zolgad joins in studio, and I do have a question that sort of pertains to Daunte Culpepper. We were talking about him a little bit because it's Sean Taylor's birthday, and as you know, Sean Taylor was killed just a few years into his career, which looked like it was going to be a Hall of Fame career. He would have been 37 today, and he's one of the players, the all-time players that I think of. What would that guy have been if not for what happened to him? And not that Daunte Culpepper was killed, obviously, but his knee falls apart and he's never the same after that. Does he fall under that same category? I did a huge thing on our YouTube page about Teddy Bridgewater in the what if, and Bridgewater is a huge one because the team was so good after Bridgewater. And we always wonder, would he have gotten them over the hump in 2017? Would they have been in the playoffs in 2016 and 2018 with Teddy? How good would he have become? But there's so much less of that, I think, with Daunte. And yet I can't figure out whether Daunte Culpepper was a really good quarterback or not by looking at the stats that he put up, by remembering watching him play, because he's such a conundrum. He has those 2 years that are unreal, but he has a ton of sacks, a ton of fumbles and things like that, and years that are just throwaway bad seasons.
This is such an interesting conversation because I don't think there's a definitive yes or no, and here's exactly why. I was covering the Packers in 2004 and saw him play twice or three times, I believe, with the playoff game that year, and he was phenomenal, off the charts. He was absolutely great. Moss, I think, was in and out that year a little bit, but Daunte Culpepper was an MVP candidate legitimately that year. I started covering the Vikings for the Star Tribune with Seifert in 2005. His offensive coordinator was gone. The guy who was his offensive coordinator then was also asked to coach the offensive line, which was ridiculous. He definitely was not the same quarterback. He was not the leader that I expected him to be, which is also, in fairness to Daunte, to say that I did cover Brett Favre, and so it went from Favre to Culpepper, which might not be a fair comparison. But if Daunte Culpepper, I think, had the right infrastructure with the right team, he could have been a star still. Not now, but he could have been a star. And his career, while certainly I don't think it would end in Canton by any means, was a career that would have had a much different arc if his knee doesn't blow up that day in Carolina. You have to keep in mind, too. So here's the weird thing with Daunte. Daunte, at some point in the 2000s, signed that, at the time, I believe, $100 million contract, Matthew. And it was, oh my gosh, he's getting, well, it turned out to be worth like $12. It was one of those non-guaranteed. Yep. The Vikings got the best of that deal. Long story short, 2005 in training camp, on a Saturday, and I remember this vividly in Mankato, he disappears for a day. And Tice's whole thing was, he's taking a personal day. He was holding out, all right? 2005 goes sideways. The team completely changes. Moss is gone, which played a big role. And Daunte, in 2005, to me, was not even close to being the same player. 2006, the expectation, when Childress, if you were to believe Brad Childress, and there's no reason not to believe him, when Brad Childress got the job in 2006, Brad Childress talks to this day about the fact that he thought he was inheriting a quarterback who was coming off a serious injury and a bad year, but was still a franchise quarterback.
Yeah.
And Childress's whole platform was that was going to be my guy. That's the whole thing that comes up then when Daunte's like, hey, I'm going to work out in Florida. And Childress went through that litany of, I can see a strip mall. He was basically going to a fitness club to rehab a knee injury that was catastrophic. It falls apart there. He gets traded for a second-round pick to the Dolphins. It doesn't work out there. He then bounces, I think, from the Dolphins to the Raiders, to the Lions, something like that. So the answer to your question is, if the circumstances had been different for Daunte, I think the career is different. I don't think it's a Hall of Fame career. But you got to remember, when he came along with that size and that athletic ability, that was a very different thing. Now you'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, I can see this. At that time, it was different. So this is, to me, the Culpepper conversation. And I was not a huge fan, but it's definitely a shades of gray conversation. It's not I think he would have been fantastic, or no, he wasn't that good. I think when things were set up for him in a way that was favorable. Daunte Culpepper's athletic ability was really off the charts.
Do you think that if it were today, if Daunte Culpepper came into the league, as you mentioned, that they would have been much more willing to set up the offense exactly to what he did well? Because he has some great touch on his deep throws, and when he explodes in terms of running the ball, it's crazy to watch a man that large
He scared
taking
people.
off. Yeah.
Defenders were scared.
You could see it on the game that I watched back. You could see it right there with certain guys running away from him or not wanting to throw themselves in his body, which is extremely rare for a quarterback. He's one that you actually would have guessed, look at this guy's size, he will stay healthy, which really tells you in the Kyler Murray conversation that, Russell Wilson is healthy his whole career. Daunte Culpepper gets hurt. You never really know. It's not about how big you are or whatever else. Lamar Jackson was too skinny or something. It's just random. Sometimes you get hurt, sometimes you don't. But in today's game, I think with the mindset of the younger offensive coordinators, especially that sort of have adopted what Andy Reid has passed down of working to your players' strengths and things like that, what Kyle Shanahan tries to do, that's where I could have seen Daunte Culpepper maybe having more success. In that time span, 15 years, offensive philosophy, I think, has changed quite a bit. So you would have had them using his legs effectively, but maybe designing more things that were easier for him to read or to handle, and then were mixed with deep shots. Because even look what the Vikings did with Kirk Cousins last year. They looked at him and said, all right, you can't run the offense that the Eagles were running with Nick Foles. That's just not who you are. You're not a guy who is an RPO quarterback or a quick screen quarterback. You need to have bootlegs. You need to be taking advantage of how well you throw the football down the field. Even the Saints, Drew Brees can't throw the ball farther than you can these days, and he's got 120 quarterback rating because Sean Payton has him throwing all these underneath passes, and he's just so good at executing them that with that, Culpepper, as that transition from the early 2000s into later in his career, Culpepper might have seen more success if he never got hurt.
Absolutely, yeah. And keep in mind, too, he's drafted in 99 by Green. And Dennis Green was really adept at identifying talent, and offensively was a good coach.
Yeah.
So I think when Green drafted Culpepper, Denny at that time had a very good idea of exactly what he thought that Daunte could do. And in some ways, Green was probably ahead of his time as far as being willing to adapt and adjust. But then he gets fired. It goes to Tice. Ticey, I loved him, but Ticey's thing was trying to make Moss happy and trying to keep people happy. But the answer to your question is, if Dennis Green hadn't got fired, and let's say Daunte gets drafted by the Vikings coming out of college, let's say in 1993 or something, I think his career is very successful. It's longer term, and Green was a guy who was willing to go in the direction the team's definitely going now, which is, if you can do something, let's just do that, as opposed to, these are my principles, we're going to run them. And that's where Daunte ultimately might have been right about Childress too. I don't think Childress had any interest in changing things.
Yeah.
I think Brad saw Daunte as being his franchise quarterback, but I don't think Brad said, I'm going to adjust to what Daunte does well. And so if Daunte had come back and played for Brad, I don't think that that's a surefire hit right there. I think that there could have been some problems.
Also, the defenses for the years where Culpepper was the quarterback are just hilarious. 26th, 31st, 31st.
We didn't think they were funny.
2003, they actually had a very good defense that year. That was when I think they would have gotten, would it have been some good players coming in at that point, because they really took a big step forward. But for the most part, they only ranked in the top 15 one time while Culpepper was their quarterback. And that kind of says a lot, too, about his win-loss record and why they didn't have more success. If you rank 31st in points allowed, you're going to struggle. And they were giving up over 400 one year, and that's in 2002 when the scoring wasn't that great, the year from the game that we just talked about. So if you're scoring 400 points and still losing a lot,
weird year.
Yeah, that really shouldn't happen. So it's an interesting career that he had, and he ends up being in sort of the annals of Vikings quarterbacks.
This is
really,
I love this one.
Yeah, but he's really kind of a blip though. But where does he rank?
But he's not.
You know?
He's not because look at the blips.
But that's how he's thought of.
Right. But he shouldn't be, because look at the blips. Favre is a blip.
Yeah.
Favre's here 1 year, basically. 2010's a disaster. Joe Kapp, gets them to a Super Bowl, but is a blip.
Yeah.
The incredible thing, Matthew, is if you look back through the list of Vikings quarterbacks right now, here's my question. Is Daunte Culpepper second to Tarkington? Now, Tommy Kramer, I loved him as a kid, and Kramer played here a long time. So it might go Tark, Kramer, Daunte. But if you look at anyone who played here for 4 to 5 years, and Tark was here 61 to 67, and then came back in 72 to 78. But if you look at guys beyond Tarkington, Daunte Culpepper is probably second or third.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And Kramer has a fascinating career that's sort of,
I love Tommy.
Really, really good to start. And then he's got injuries and things like that and doesn't win a whole lot, then has a pop-up year toward the end of his career, and then it goes back down the other side of the hill. And it's a wild ride with Tommy Kramer, but it's hard to say that he was better than Daunte Culpepper, who had an MVP caliber season and would have won it if not for Peyton Manning, and had 2 playoff wins for them. And also his first season is really incredible too. That does say a lot about this team in terms of the quarterback history. You've got the Rich Gannon years that were also kind of a wild ride where sometimes he's the quarterback, sometimes he's not. Same with Wade Wilson. I mean, Warren Moon ends up on this list. If you're ranking all the Vikings quarterbacks of all time, Moon probably ends up, he's got a 10-6 season, an 8-8 season.
The
top
90s.
Offenses.
Look at the 90s.
It's really wild.
Look at the 90s. Sean Salisbury plays. Rich Gannon plays. Jim McMahon. They trade with Houston for Moon. Randall Cunningham surfaces here. The 90s is incredible.
It really is.
Jeff George.
It's funny because maybe 2 or 3 years from now we'll be saying, like, where does Cousins rank? Because if he wins another playoff game, then he's got to be better than Daunte, because Daunte was so inconsistent.
Yeah.
Is the 2 great years. But if Cousins over the next, let's say he plays here for 3 years, I'm a little skeptical of it, whether that actually happens. But let's say he plays through his entire contract extension. He probably ends up as number 2 behind Fran Tarkenton if he wins one more playoff game. Because he's going to put up numbers. We know that.
Yeah, he already does. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, he does. And guess what? That is an indictment of Vikings quarterbacks beyond belief.
It definitely
is. How can Fran Tarkenton still be the guy that you speak of with a reverence, because nobody else really approaches that? For a franchise that's been around now, I believe if we play football in 2020, it's going to be the 60-year anniversary of the franchise.
I know.
Think about that.
It's really incredible. What do we say about Brad Johnson, like in his Viking career? Just wasn't really long enough to be considered for this.
12th round draft pick.
Does have a second
like a
stint,
12th round draft pick. He does. He came back. In fact, he succeeded Culpepper when Daunte's knee blew out, and then was Childress' starter in 2006. Had no arm. Incredibly smart. I would say Brad Johnson, if I were asked to define watching him play as a Viking, would be stability. He was stable. He was not a flashy QB, and he certainly would not make my list of top Vikings QBs, but he was a stable QB. And again, for, I believe, a 12th round draft pick, something like that.
28 and 18 is a starter.
Pretty damn good.
So here's how it goes for all-time wins for Vikings quarterbacks. This is truly funny. So Fran,
why do you keep calling it funny?
I mean,
I was forced to watch this.
It's actually great because I love journeyman quarterbacks, and it's almost like this franchise selected me from Buffalo. Yes. No, come here. This is where you'll find you're used to Jim Kelly and a bunch of garbage.
Yep.
Now try this, though. A bunch of guys who were randomly great for a year, as all journeymen are. So Fran is number 1 with 91, obviously. Mm-hmm. Tommy Kramer is second, but a 54 and 56 record. Okay. Culpepper 38 and 42 as a Viking. Again, like a 500 quarterback. This is the argument for Brad Johnson. 28 and 18, 4th all-time winningest Viking quarterback.
Think about that.
That's amazing. And then Wade Wilson 27 and 21.
Yeah, Wade, man, it's my time. So I started watching this franchise in 1978. Look at the quarterback since then. If you want to know why I'm a confused football fan, you can figure it out very quickly. Tarkington was my last year. My first year was his last year.
Yeah.
And after that, it's not been a gong show. It's been a wild ride.
Teddy Bridgewater is not that far down on the list of all-time Viking quarterbacks in terms of wins. And he played here for 2 years. And one of them was his rookie year where he didn't even start the first game.
Yeah.
That really speaks to the inconsistency. So, yeah, I think that we're not actually that far off, maybe 2 seasons away if Cousins plays at the same exact level from him being the second best quarterback in Vikings history, and half the fan base or more wants somebody else. So, yeah, I don't know.
A second playoff win is correct, though. He's got to win
Yep.
at least one, if not two more playoff games.